and we are going to talk about an article that was published on Saturday Blitz, I believe is the website that I found it on. Every now and then, Jordan, I don't know, you probably do this as well. But especially in the off season when there's not a lot going on, you kind of go into Google and you type college football news, Clemson football news, and you just kind of read through articles, visit the various Clemson sites and the college football sites around there. And that's kind of what I've done today to lay out a few topics for us and to talk about some of these national writers and things that are being said about our Clemson Tigers. And Connor, um, from Saturday Blitz published an article this week. His top five most overrated teams heading into the 2024 season. And the list is, it has five, obviously Clemson is on the list. That's why we're talking about it. But Oklahoma's on that list. Texas A&M's on that list. Miami was actually number one on the list. Clemson came in at number two. And then Penn State was also on this list. And Connor kind of laid out his case for why Clemson was amongst the top five of most overrated programs coming into the 2024 season. In my opinion, he didn't do a great job of kind of laying out his plan because I believe his first sentence was it's hard to call Clemson overrated when it's projected to be a top 15, top 20 team. Yes, it is hard to call Clemson overrated if they're projected to be a top 15 team. I think due to the roster talent, you would absolutely that would be a fair shake of where you would put Clemson preseason, right? I don't think there's a lot there, and the reasons that he kind of laid out for why Clemson is one of the most overrated programs. It's obviously Dabo Sweeney. It's his stance on the transfer portal. It's the fact that he didn't bring in a single transfer in this portal cycle. That was really his major complaint, that Dabo Sweeney and Clemson as a whole is falling further and further behind each and every season. What were your thoughts, Jordan? I sent you this article earlier and let you know that we were going to talk about it on the show today. What were your thoughts on kind of what Connor laid out in this brief article? And, Clemson coming in at number two on Connor's list of SaturdayBlitz.com's most overrated programs in 2024.
Yeah, and I want to preface this by saying, like, I don't like to bash, writers or anything like that. And honestly, this is more of a symptom of kind of what I've noticed. You and I have both noticed
Yeah.
uh, about the discourse around Clemson. Uh, there just doesn't seem to be much in the sense of, you know, doing any actual research when it comes to Clemson. I feel like when people talk about Clemson, especially this offseason, it's been the same retired, repeated and, just beaten to death talking points where it gets to the point where it's like, well, okay, well, I can't even, like, do you even know a player on the roster, or do you know anything about what Clemson's bringing back? Do you know what the staff makeup is? Do you know anything other than Clemson didn't take a transfer portal player this cycle? And so it's one of those things where it's you kind of when the college football media in general is bombarding you with the same talking points over and over and over again, the casual college football fan or observer from a distance who's not, who doesn't follow the program and doesn't, know the ins and outs of the program, they adopt that mindset as well. It's not just, and it's not just fans, it's writers. And so I think kind of reading this article, he said multiple contradictory things about Clemson being good enough and having the talent to contend for an ACC title, but then also saying that they were overrated and that he wasn't sure if they were good enough to compete for a playoff spot. So I'm like, it's one of those things where you've adopted that mindset to the point where you don't even really think about what you're saying when you actually type it. It's just you say the things that you've heard from other people, and then you insert your own opinions here or there in there, and frame it around that, when with no regard to whether or not you're actually making any sense.
Right.
So it's that's kind of one of the frustrating things about listening to the conversation about Clemson this offseason. And we talked about it a lot last week. It's just everybody's being lazy. And I don't want to say everybody, but a large majority of college football media is, they're just regurgitating what they've been fed from others. It's like, oh, Dabo didn't use the transfer portal. And obviously his comments last week have exacerbated that and made it even more of a talking point.
Yes.
But at the end of the day, it's like Clemson didn't take a transfer portal player. I mean, that is what it is. But they still got to play the games. The games still have to be played. Clemson is just as good and capable of winning the games as everybody else. And so it's like, when are we going to stop talking about what Clemson didn't do and what they and talk about what they did do? And that's kind of my biggest frustration when I read that article. And the article itself, was, I mean, it's one of those off-season pieces.
Yeah.
Like you said, it's one of those times. It's this time of year where college football news is slow and people are just finding stuff to generate clicks. But you could have you can put a little bit more effort, and this just goes to college football writers in general.
Yes.
And college football talking, media in general. It's the same lazy takes over and over again, and that's kind of my biggest frustration.
Yeah, and look, you make a lot of good points, Jordan, and we've talked about this, quite often on the show, just the narrative that's out there about Clemson. And the only thing that you ever hear from the national media, and then it gets, to your point, parroted by the more casual fans in college football that don't, necessarily, they're not paying attention to Clemson's roster, right? They're not paying attention in depth to Clemson's recruiting and who they have on the roster, and all of that, and their depth chart and all of that stuff. And, most people don't have time for that. So I'm not faulting anybody for that. But it's when you get the national media types who are paid to research and know the sport, and they have teams that do this. I just feel like constantly, when anytime Clemson is brought up, it's only talking about the portal. And in my opinion, it's just a lazy approach and a lazy take to talk about with Clemson football. Is there valid points when it comes to the portal and Clemson? 100%. I think we laid that out very clearly in last week's show, right? When we talked about Dabo's comments on the portal and some of the things that he should and should not say, right? But to kind of bring up a couple of my issues with this article that Connor wrote. And look, I don't know Connor. I'm not bashing him. He's a sports writer, and I'm sure he writes nationally, right? Like he writes for every and any team out there. So he's probably not intimately aware of the ins and outs of Clemson's roster, right? But a couple of things that just really bothers me with his article, and I think it speaks to the larger thing that you were talking about, Jordan, with the lazy takes in the national media. He immediately he immediately points out Dabo's lack of use in the transfer portal. And then he points out a statement that we talked about in length last week when Dabo said majority of the players in the portal aren't good enough to play at Clemson. And according to Connor, that's a delusional statement. Contrary, okay? Yeah. With the type of football program that Clemson is, most of the players in the portal aren't good enough to play at Clemson. There's a good chunk of them that are, but most are not good enough to play at Clemson. And if most were good enough to play at Clemson, you wouldn't be talking about Clemson winning 9 or 10 games. I can tell you that, or even 8 games. So no. That was, kind of the first point that he made that I kind of took issue with. And then he and you kind of mentioned this, Jordan. I just want to read so that I'm not paraphrasing his stuff, right? I want to represent what he said properly. He said Clemson has the talent on the roster to contend for an ACC title, but it feels like the program is falling too far behind in the national race to even compete for a playoff spot. So, that's all one sentence. You contradicted yourself in the same sentence. If they're
Right.
competing for an ACC title, they're also competing for a national or a playoff spot. It's a 12-team playoff, and if they win the ACC, they get an automatic bid to the playoff. So that was kind of one of the things that just kind of came out. And then he talks more about Sweeney doesn't use the portal, and then he says something interesting. He said if Sweeney utilized the portal, his team may have avoided this list, but they are looking at another 9 to 10 win season at best, in my opinion. And this is something else that I really want to talk about. He follows that up by, is that good enough for the 10 to 20 range? Of course it is. Are you telling me a team in a Power 4 conference, which is what we're operating in now, that wins 9 or 10 games isn't going to be ranked in the top 10 to 20? And they play a schedule like Clemson does this upcoming season? You're crazy if you think that they wouldn't be ranked in the top 10 to 20. That's first and foremost. The other thing that I really want to talk about, and I've started to see this more and more as people in college football and around college football circles are discussing Clemson and the regression that our program has obviously gone through, right? I make no refutes that Clemson football as a program has regressed. That's very clear. No one can deny that. No one is trying to deny that in my mind. Okay. So that's first and foremost. But to sit here and act like that that you're a bad football program from a Clemson standpoint because you're only winning 9 or maybe 10 games a year is crazy to me. Like, these people are throwing around 9 and 10 wins like they mean nothing in college football. This is major college football. And I get everybody out there is going to say, oh, well, Clemson plays in the ACC. They have an easy schedule and all of this stuff. Okay, fair enough. You don't respect the ACC. I don't care what conference you play in. If you win 9 or 10 games, you're a good football program. And the fact that
Especially
people,
consistently.
yeah,
That's
consistently winning 9 or 10 games, not winning one, every now and then winning 9 or 10 games. Clemson has consistently done this for the past decade plus, right? So it's crazy to me how when we're talking Clemson, how suddenly 9 and 10 wins mean nothing. And I get the regression. And I'm first and foremost, like, I want Clemson to get back to the point where they're competing for national championships year in and year out. We're clearly not there, but we're also not on the floor winning 3 games a year either. So, I feel like there's just this approach that is, I wouldn't say it's unfair. Like, the criticism is fair, but I feel like there's some excessive criticism because the bottom hasn't fallen out, right? Clemson is still competing for the ACC every single year. They're still winning, 9 and 10 games a year. They're still a very good football program. They're not elite anymore. They're not at the top of college football or near the top of college football anymore, right? But we're still right there, right? And the ship can still be righted. So what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, yeah, you hit it, and that's kind of the thing. I saw a post from Larry Williams over at Tiger Illustrated, who does good stuff, and he lined it out really well about just kind of what the narratives about the transfer portal have kind of done as far as the conversation and the attitude towards Clemson football. And he goes in depth about kind of how the transfer portal and NIL era also coincided with the drop off in play for Clemson at quarterback and wide receiver, and how and some of the staff some of the staff shakeup that wasn't properly addressed. And
Yeah.
so the transfer portal NIL era has been a convenient sort of scapegoat for what Clemson, why Clemson has seen the decline it has, when in reality, it's a lot deeper than that. And it's not because Clemson didn't lose 4 games because they didn't use the transfer portal, and they didn't, DJ Uyunglele didn't succeed because they didn't use the transfer portal. And the wide receivers that didn't pan out weren't because they didn't use the transfer portal, or really NIL, but it's been a convenient coincidence. And so the national media and people who don't like we said, the people that don't follow the program and know the ins and outs, they're going to it's a very convenient talking point. And so I think you kind of nailed it. And that's kind of one of the frustrating things, because it's like, well, at the end of the day, in order for Clemson to dispel that narrative, they're going to have to win games, because until they right the ship and look more like the Clemson that people had gotten used to seeing, that's going to be the talking point, whether it's true or not. And so you kind of we talked about how frustrating it is, and how dishonest all of it is, but that's kind of the reality of, and kind of the bed that we've made for ourselves. I just say we in a figurative sense. Mm-hmm. So this is just one of those things where you just kind of have to be like, well, there's going to be more Clemson overrated articles and more Dabo isn't using the transfer portal articles until you go out and win games. But I think this team is positioned to win games in a good amount. We talked about it. I really like what this team has this year. And so it's one of those it's one of those things where you just got to go win games. And what Clemson used to do, shut them up by winning games on the field. And that's how you go about doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, all you can do if you're Clemson at this point, and if you're Dabo Swinney at this point, is you can win games. That's really the only thing that is going to curb some of this criticism of the transfer portal and overall the football program in general. So, I don't believe Clemson is overrated. Let us know what you think about in the comment section. Do you believe Clemson is overrated? They were also accompanied on this list by Connor over at Saturday Blitz with Miami, Penn State, Texas A&M, and Oklahoma. Rounded out with Clemson, obviously. Those were the top 5 most overrated programs heading into 2024. I will, with Jordan, will agree to disagree with our buddy Connor. No hate to him. Just thought it was an interesting article. And it's not really just Connor. It's kind of the overarching media, which is kind of our point.